Oh, it's great to be with you and to celebrate with Bill. Congrats, Bill. Great, we got the slides up. I'm loving the energy in the room. Libertarians turn out to be fun, so that's a great deal. This is the UK cover, which is actually my preferred cover. You can see the weirdest people in the world pictured there. I love the ham with that was at the tables I grew up at. Okay, so to get us started, what I want to do is give you one of the tasks that psychologists have used around the world to begin to get at some of the psychological variation that I'm going to show to you. So this is called the I am task, or the who am I task. And what I want you to do is think about how you'd finish this sentence 3 times. We don't have very much time. When psychologists do it, they do it 20 times, and then you can score it. So I could answer this by telling you that I'm Jessica's father, I'm a brother, or I'm Ara's friend. That would be one way of doing it. I'd probably actually do it like this. I am curious, I'm a scientist, I'm a sea kayaker. So think about the difference between those two. The way I just answered it, I'm talking about my attributes, my aspirations, my accomplishments. I'm telling you about myself, about who am I. I'm doing a little self-enhancement, pointing out good points, maybe that might be interesting. Or I could have focused on my relationships, my relatives, and my roles. Relationships that I've acquired by virtue of being born into a particular social structure, into a social network. So people answer these 20 statements, and then you can score them. And what you find out is that there's a lot of variation around the world, and this captures part of what's in the individualism complex. So if we were to do it with people in this room, many of you would do things like curious and sea kayaker and science. Well, you probably wouldn't do scientists. I don't know how many scientists there are, but probably some. But this has been acknowledged for a long time by anthropologists. So the anthropologist Clifford Geertz pointed out a long time ago that this notion of a unified self, Americans are always looking for their true selves. This actually varies quite a bit around the world, and a lot of people don't think about it that way. And this is part of a collection of traits associated with individualism, this atomic view of the self, a sense of overconfidence, guilt instead of shame, overconfidence, self-enhancement, and So these are just a small collection of traits that seem to bunch together. We're not sure if they're all part of a particular way of thinking, but at least when you look at a population level, they tend to clump together. So to give you a sense of guilt versus shame, so many anthropologists have long noticed that there's many societies that are shame-driven. So people are trying to avoid looking bad to others in their group, and of course we all know what shame feels like. But societies that are individualistic tend to be more guilt-driven, which means we feel bad for not living up to our own standards. These standards may not be widely shared. People may not think badly of if you don't do it. Just to give you one example, if you take a nap instead of go to the gym, you might feel guilty about that. But it's not that there's going to be a big shame thing and people are going to look down on your family and things like that. So that gives you a little bit of a sense there. Overconfidence is something that we've studied in my lab quite a bit, and Westerners and in more individualistic societies tend to be overconfident. No matter how much information you give them, they still think they're a better than average driver, for example. Most people think they're a better than average driver. So if we map the world, this is just using country level data, we find out there's a lot of variation. So one of the things I'm going to be emphasizing is there's not a dichotomy here, there's continuous variation along a number of different dimensions, but we can see that there's variation in this individualism complex, and the 3 most individual places in the world are Americans, Australians, and Brits at the top of the list, and then quite a bit of variation. You'll notice the gray, that's things that, those are places where we don't have data, and it would only further exaggerate the picture I'm inferring from other kinds of data that we have. Okay. Now, one of the things you're going to be seeing is, as was alluded to by Chris, is that there's Western countries tend to be at the extreme end. So I want to get to the question of why that's the case. But before I do that, I want to show you, at least give you a hint that this psychological variation actually has important economic outcomes. So we might think, and this is what economists used to tell me in the 1990s, that all this cultural stuff you're worried about, Joe, is just going to wash out once we put real money on the line and create incentives. But this is a plot meant to make the point that actually a number of studies now show that more individualistic people and places tend to be more inventive. They tend to come up with more new patents, for example. There's other kinds of data we could look at. Economists ranks countries according to their innovativeness. We can do the same analyses and show that more individualistic countries are more inventive. My good friend Daron Acemoglu has shown even at the firm level, firms led by more individualistic leaders tend to be more inventive. We can put students in experiments, prime them with individualism, and they'll be more creative on measures of creativity. So there is interesting variation there. But now this individualism complex, which lots of people have acknowledged for a long time, turns out to just be the tip of a psychological iceberg in terms of variation around the world in how people think, feel, and reason. So one of the surprising ways that people vary across societies in how they think, feel, and reason is that in judging, say, something like a theft or a murder, people in Western societies and more individualistic societies tend to place heavy weight on the intentions, on the hidden mental states of the people doing the action. Whereas in other places, they tend to place much more weight on just the outcome, so less concern about the hidden mental states. And that's probably non-intuitive for many of you, but you can get a little bit of a sense of how it makes sense if you think that, well, really you don't know what other people's mental states are. It's all guesswork. And so when I talk to my Fijian friends where I do field work, they're like, well, why would you use mental states when you're not sure what they are? So let's just focus on what actually happened. So it makes some sense there. Holistic versus analytic thinking. So holistic thinkers break problems down into small parts. They assign property to those parts, and then they use that to explain the system, how the system works. Physics, you break things down into smaller particles, you give those particles properties, and then that explains how things go. Economics, you give people preferences and beliefs, and then that explains what they do. So that's analytic thinking. This is compared to holistic thinking, where people tend to look at context and background and take into account a number of factors. And this varies quite a bit around the world. Non-relational morality, the tendency to think about just general standards of care and harm versus kind of local group loyalty, local hierarchy, things like that. That varies. And dispositional thinking, so the tendency to assign, to explain things by reference to individual disposition. So why did he steal it? He's dishonest, rather than by suggesting some kind of contextual thing. So why is he late for work? Well, he's irresponsible. Or maybe he had a flat tire. And that relates to two other kinds of things, which would be the fundamental attribution error and cognitive dissonance. So if you've had a basic class in social psychology, you've probably heard about those. And they're put forth as features of humans. But it turns out that only in Western societies are they particularly strong. And you can certainly find societies where these don't appear at all. So when you think about psychology textbooks, you're actually reading Western cultural psychology. You're not reading general principles of human psychology. All right. Trust in strangers varies a lot around the world. It's been linked by economists repeatedly and in lots of studies to better economic performance. That varies quite a bit. As well as conformity and patience, and I could go on. It's a long list. So as my colleagues and I began to review the evidence, this is sort of 2007, 2008, we began to notice all of this psychological variation in the world. So we coined this acronym, not to insult anyone, but to raise the consciousness of researchers that the subject pools for which they were using to draw their conclusions were psychologically unusual. So those are some of the things I mentioned a second ago that seem to clump together. And if you look at psychological studies even today, so I've been going on about this for about 11 years, and every now and then somebody checks in to see how the psychologists are doing, and they seem to have got it down from 96% to 95% of their subjects are from weird societies. So slow progress here, although much better progress in economics. So some of the best data that I draw on comes from economics, who they seem to have gotten the culture idea. Okay, now this isn't just kind of values. There's a sense in which people think about the brain as a digital computer. So there's hardware and software, and maybe this is just the software. But we now know from neuroscience that software-hardware distinction doesn't make sense. The brain is kind of full of firmware, and as we learn and experience the world, we reprogram and rewire our brains, we change the hardware. So the differences that I could lay out for you affect very basic things that cognitive scientists talk about when they talk about how brains work. So things like memory and attention, spatial reasoning and how we think about time, even visual perception. So your ability to judge the length of two lines seems to vary across societies, and we're beginning to get ways to explain why these societies vary. And so that's part of my enterprise today. The only kind of cautionary note, when we coined this acronym, we meant it as a consciousness-raising device, but of course, then people take your idea and do all kinds of crazy things with it. So we don't mean to say there's a dichotomy in the world. So you don't want to begin thinking about the world as weird people and non-weird people. There's continuous variation along a number of dimensions. So many Western societies occupy a corner in an n-dimensional space, if you can imagine that. Probably most of you can't imagine n-dimensional space, but it's good to stretch. It's good to stretch. All right, and another kind of cautionary note, is it good to be a conformist? Because one of the things I've noticed in giving this talk, this is all very clinical for me. There's interesting variation, and it's good to explore psychological diversity, but people tend to be a little judgmental about the characteristics, and they like some, and they think others aren't so good. So I like to talk about conformity, which there's now enough research from different societies that in some societies you could show them a video of kids being either conformists or independent, and the parents in some places will say, yeah, the conformist one is the smart one, that's the good one. And other parents in places like Texas would say things like, no, we like the independent one, that's the smart one, he's the good one. So there's this variation in what people think is good, and I'm going to be making the case that actually at least what would lead to success in your society would depend on the details of your institutions. So our psychology adapts to the institutions they have to navigate. Now, of course, you can have a mismatch where you might migrate to a new place, or the rules might change, or something like that. Because culture takes a few generations to shift. Okay. So the two key questions I want to ask are, how can we explain this variation that we've now widely documented around the world? So in the last 10 years since we first pointed this out, the data has really been coming in, and like I mentioned, mostly from economics. And then if we can explain that, does this help us understand the origins of many of the modern political, economic, legal institutions that we now find around the world? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of how I got there, and I'm just going to sketch the basic argument. So the argument here is that psychology is really central. There's lots of interesting variation around the world, and some psychologies are more conducive to the construction of some and the operation of some kinds of institutions. So things like representative government, religions like Protestantism, enterprises like science, more rapid innovation, things like financial markets require high levels of trust, and economic growth are going to be facilitated by psychology, and I discuss this in the book. So why does psychology vary? I think there's probably lots of reasons, but one of the ones we found that seems to explain many of the traits that I've been discussing is the structure of the family. I'm going to say more about that in a few minutes. Now, in the case of Europe, I make the argument that the structure of families transformed, and that opened the door to new kinds of institutions. So this begins to occur in the early Middle Ages, so think 800, 900, so Carolingian Empire is heavily involved in this transformation. And that allowed the commercial revolution to begin. People began grouping in voluntary associations, so you get the emergence of guilds and universities. Charter towns begin, where you write a charter and you agree amongst individuals to get together and have a town. This led to competition amongst voluntary associations. So one of the things I spend time in the book in is that having voluntary associations where people can freely join different monasteries, different towns, different firms, leads to a process that affects people's psychology. So the green arrows are all suggesting there are psychological implications of that change. So families affect people's psychology, but so does competition among firms or other kinds of organizations. Now in Europe, beginning in the high Middle Ages, you get rapidly rising urbanization. Europe has about 1% urbanization in 800. By 1200, it's passing China in terms of its level of urbanization. Occupational choice, people are much freer to select into occupation rather than occupations being determined by your clan or caste, as they were in places like China and India. This gives rise to a lot more market integration, so more impersonal markets. Of course, markets are old, but this is a particular kind of market, and that's going to have effects for weird psychology.